It wasn't supposed to happen. If someone had told me 6 months ago that I'd be sitting in an empty office, drenched in guilt and adrenaline, staring into the eyes of my 23-year-old stepson as thunder raged outside, I would have laughed. But that night, something shifted. Something I still can't fully explain. The storm had started innocently enough. The office was almost deserted by 7 p.m., with only the hum of computers and the occasional buzz of a text message breaking the silence. I'd been glued to my desk, finishing up project reports that were due the next morning. Across the room, Evan sat at his workstation, headphones on, fingers flying over his keyboard as he debugged the game we'd been pouring months of work into. Evan had joined the company a little over a year ago, fresh out of college. He was talented, more so than most junior developers I'd worked with. It didn't hurt that he was charming, with an easy smile and a self-assuredness that most young men lacked. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, the kind that drew people in without trying too hard. He was also my stepson. When Evan moved in with us after college, I didn't think much of it. I'd been married to his father, Dean, for over a decade, and though we weren't exactly close, I'd always tried to be a good stepmom. But living together, and then working together, blurred the lines in ways I hadn't anticipated. That night, the storm hit harder than anyone expected. The sky outside was a black sheet, lit up occasionally by jagged streaks of lightning. Rain lashed against the windows, and the office power flickered ominously. By the time I realized how bad it was, the streets were already flooding. "I think we're stuck here," Evan said, pulling off his headphones and leaning back in his chair. His voice was calm, as if being stranded in an empty office during a storm was no big deal. I glanced at the clock. It was almost 9 p.m. "The news says the roads are completely flooded," I replied, scrolling through my phone. "It's not safe to drive right now." "Well," he said with a grin, "looks like it's just you and me." There was nothing particularly suggestive in his tone, but something about the way his eyes lingered on mine made my stomach tighten. I looked away quickly, pretending to focus on the screen in front of me. As the hours dragged on, the tension in the room became palpable. We talked about work at first, discussing deadlines and game mechanics, but the conversation eventually drifted to more personal topics. "I don't know how you do it," Evan said, breaking the silence. "Do what?" "Juggle all this. Work, life at home, dealing with my dad." I laughed, but it came out hollow. "It's not as seamless as it looks." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You make it look easy. I mean, honestly, you're the only reason this project hasn't completely fallen apart. Everyone knows that." His words caught me off guard. Compliments from Evan weren't new. He was naturally warm and expressive. But this felt different. There was something deeper in his tone, something that made my pulse quicken. "Thank you," I said, avoiding his gaze. "That means a lot." Another crack of thunder rattled the windows, and the power cut out completely. The room plunged into darkness, except for the faint glow of our monitors. "Great," I muttered, feeling my way toward the nearest desk drawer for a flashlight. "Wait," Evan said, and I heard him get up. A moment later, his hand brushed against mine, guiding me toward a chair. "Sit. I'll find the flashlight." His touch was brief but electric. I sat down, my heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with the storm. When he returned, the small beam of the flashlight illuminated his face. He looked different in the dim light. Softer. No venote. He handed me the flashlight, but instead of stepping back, he stayed close, his knee brushing against mine. "I've always admired you, he said quietly. I froze. "Evan? No, let me say this." His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of emotion that made my chest tighten. "You've been nothing but kind to me since the day I moved in. You're strong, smart, and honestly, you're the most amazing person I've ever met." I didn't know how to respond. My mind was racing, trying to find a way to diffuse the situation, but my body betrayed me. My breath hitched, and my hands gripped the edge of the chair as his words settled over me like a warm blanket. The room felt too small, the air too thick. I could feel the heat radiating off him, the faint scent of his cologne mingling with the sterile office air. This isn't right," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "Why not?" he asked, his voice soft but insistent. "Because of my dad? Because we work together?" "Yes," I said, though the word felt hollow. Evan knelt down in front of me, his hands resting lightly on my knees. The flashlight's beam wavered, casting shifting shadows across the room. "Claire," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I know you feel it too." I couldn't answer. I didn't trust myself to speak. The storm outside roared louder, but inside everything was still. When he leaned in, I didn't stop him. His lips brushed against mine. Tentative at first, then more confident when I didn't pull away. The kiss was soft and slow, but it ignited something inside me that I hadn't felt in years. The sound of rain pounding against the windows faded into the background as I let myself get lost in the moment. My hands found their way to his shoulders, pulling him closer, as the weight of everything, my marriage, my role as his stepmother, the risk of being caught, melted away. For the first time in a long time, I felt alive. It started months before that night in the storm. Looking back now, I can see all the little moments that led to it, all the quiet shifts in how I saw him. At the time, though, I didn't think much of them. I told myself they were harmless, fleeting thoughts that didn't mean anything. But they did. When Evan joined the company, I was proud of him. I'd seen his talent long before anyone else did. Dean had always dismissed Evan's passion for video games as a waste of time, but I saw the way his eyes lit up when he talked about the worlds he wanted to create. I pushed Dean to put in a good word for him with a colleague, which eventually led to Evan landing the job. At work, though, he wasn't my stepson. He was just another member of my team, a promising junior developer who happened to share my last name. I thought keeping things professional would be easy, but I underestimated how much time we'd spend together. It started innocently enough. Late nights in the office, huddled over computer screens as we worked through bugs and brainstormed ideas for the game. Evan was sharp and creative, and his enthusiasm was contagious. He'd come up with ideas that no one else had thought of, and I couldn't help but admire him for it. One night, about 3 months before the storm, we were the last 2 people in the office. It was close to midnight, and most of the lights had been turned off. I was reviewing design documents at my desk when Evan walked over with 2 cups of coffee. "You look like you need this," he said, placing one in front of me. "Lifesaver," I said with a tired smile, taking a sip. It was perfect. Black, just the way I liked it. "How do you do it?" he asked, sitting on the edge of my desk. "Do what?" "Keep everything together. The deadlines, the meetings, the endless demands. If it were me, I'd probably lose it." I shrugged. "You get used to it. It helps to have a good team." "You mean me?" he said with a teasing grin. I laughed. "Don't push your luck." But the truth was, he wasn't wrong. Evan had become my go-to person for last-minute fixes and creative solutions. He worked harder than anyone else on the team, and he never complained. As the weeks went on, I started to notice little things. The way he'd linger at my desk a little longer than necessary. The way his eyes would light up when I praised his work. The way he'd find excuses to talk to me, even when it wasn't about the project. At first, I chalked it up to his natural charm. Evan had always been good at making people feel special. It was one of the reasons he was so well liked. But then there were moments that felt different. One evening, we were reviewing a cutscene for the game in the conference room. The lights were dimmed, and the glow from the projector cast shadows across the walls. Evan leaned over my shoulder to point out something on the screen, his arm brushing against mine. "See that?" he said, his voice low. "The lighting needs to be adjusted here. It's too harsh." I nodded, but I wasn't really listening. I was too aware of how close he was, the faint scent of his cologne, the warmth of his body next to mine. "Claire?" I blinked, realizing he was waiting for a response. "Right. The lighting. I'll make a note of it." He didn't move right away, and for a moment I thought he was going to say something else. But then he stepped back, leaving me feeling oddly unsettled. After that, I started to catch myself looking at him more often. I'd noticed the way his sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, revealing toned forearms, or the way his smile would reach his eyes, making him look younger and more carefree. It wasn't just at work, either. At home, I found myself paying more attention to him during dinner. The way he'd laugh at my jokes, even when they weren't that funny. The way he'd ask about my day and actually listen to the answer. Dean rarely did that anymore. One weekend, Dean went on a business trip, leaving Evan and me alone in the house. I tried to keep my distance, spending most of my time in my office, but Evan had other plans. "Hey," he said, knocking on my door. "I'm making dinner. You hungry?" I hesitated. "You're cooking?" "Don't sound so surprised," he said with a grin. "I'm not completely useless in the kitchen." I followed him downstairs, where he'd set up an impressive spread: grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, and a bottle of wine. "Where did you learn to do all this?" I asked as I sat down at the table. "College," he said, pouring us both a glass of wine. "Had to fend for myself, remember?" The meal was delicious, but it wasn't the food that stuck with me. It was the way he looked at me across the table, his eyes lingering just a little too long. It was the way his hand brushed against mine when he reached for the wine bottle. It was the way he made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. I kept replaying the evening in my mind, wondering if I was imagining things. Was I reading too much into his actions? Or was there something real between us? I tried to push the thoughts away, telling myself they were ridiculous. He was my stepson. I was his father's wife. Whatever I was feeling, it was wrong. But deep down, I knew the truth. The lines were starting to blur. The night of the storm had shaken me to my core, but it wasn't the first time I'd felt the pull toward Evan. It wasn't even the first time something had happened between us that crossed the line of propriety. About a month before the storm, there had been a work trip. Our team had been sent to a gaming convention in San Diego to showcase an early build of our project. Dean had barely noticed when I told him I'd be gone for a few days. He was too wrapped up in his latest trial to care. The trip started off normal enough. Long days at the convention booth, answering endless questions from attendees and industry professionals. Evan and I were part of a small team that traveled together, along with Jessica and 2 others from our department. During the day, I kept things professional, but the tension between Evan and me was undeniable. The hotel we stayed in was upscale, but there was a mix-up at check-in. They'd overbooked, and instead of separate rooms, Evan and I were assigned a shared suite. Jessica immediately teased us about it, smirking as she handed me the room key. "Well, this should be interesting," she said, her eyes flicking between me and Evan. "It's just one night," I said, brushing it off. "We'll manage." But I was already nervous. Sharing a space with him felt dangerous, like walking a tightrope over a canyon. The suite was spacious, with 2 beds separated by a small sitting area, but it still felt too intimate. I could feel the weight of his presence, even when he was on the other side of the room. That evening, after a long day at the convention, we both collapsed in the suite, too tired to even think about going out for dinner. I ordered room service, a bottle of wine, and a couple of burgers, and we ate in comfortable silence, the glow of the city lights streaming in through the windows. "This is nice," Evan said, leaning back on the couch. He'd kicked off his shoes and loosened his tie, looking more relaxed than I'd ever seen him. Not the sharing a room part, obviously, but just hanging out. I smiled, sipping my wine. "It is." We talked for hours that night, about everything and nothing. He told me stories from college, wild parties, late-night gaming marathons, and I found myself laughing more than I had in years. At some point, I realized how late it had gotten. The clock on the bedside table read 1:12 a.m., and the room had grown quiet. "I should probably get some sleep," I said, standing up. Evan nodded, but there was a look in his eyes that made my stomach flutter. He stood too, stepping closer, and suddenly the space between us felt impossibly small. "Claire," he said, his voice low and uncertain. I froze. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. "This is crazy," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "Maybe?" he said, his eyes searching mine. "But it doesn't feel wrong." I didn't have a chance to respond before he closed the distance between us, his lips brushing against mine in a tentative kiss. For a split second, I thought about pulling away. But then his hands found my waist, and the kiss deepened, and every ounce of resolve I'd built up over the months melted away. I don't know how long we stood there, tangled in each other, but eventually I pulled back, breathless and shaking. "We can't do this," I said, my voice barely audible. He nodded, but his hands didn't leave my waist. "I know, but I don't want to stop." Neither did I. That night, nothing more happened. I made him promise we'd keep things professional, and he agreed. though I could see the frustration in his eyes. I told myself that was the end of it, that the kiss had been a mistake we'd never repeat. But I was wrong. The night of the storm, that promise shattered completely. After the power went out and Evan kissed me in the office, something inside me broke. I couldn't stop myself, couldn't resist the pull I felt toward him any longer. We didn't talk about it. There were no words, no rationalizations. He lifted me onto the desk, and suddenly everything that had been building between us for months came rushing to the surface. His touch was firm but gentle, his hands exploring in ways that made my breath hitch. The storm outside raged on, but inside, it felt like time had stopped. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional. The way he looked at me, like I was the only person in the world, made my chest ache. I hadn't felt that way in so long, hadn't realized how much I missed being wanted. Afterward, we sat in silence, the weight of what we'd done settling over us. I could see the worry in his eyes, the same fear I felt twisting in my stomach. "We shouldn't have done that," I said finally, my voice trembling. "I know," he said, reaching for my hand, "but I don't regret it." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't regret it either, and that terrified me. The storm eventually passed, and so did the night. But something fundamental had changed between us, something we couldn't take back. From that moment on, the line we'd crossed wasn't just blurred, it was gone entirely. The days after the storm blurred into a haze of adrenaline and guilt. Evan and I tried to act as though nothing had happened, but the weight of our secret followed us everywhere. At work, at home, even in the fleeting moments we managed to steal together. I told myself it would stop, that what had happened in the office that night had been a one-time mistake. But the truth was, I didn't want to stop, and neither did Evan. It wasn't long before we found ourselves falling into a dangerous routine. At the office, we maintained our professional distance during the day, careful not to draw attention to ourselves. But late at night, when most of the team had gone home, we found excuses to stay behind. The small storage room down the hall became our haven. A cramped, dimly lit space filled with old computers and forgotten office supplies. The door locked from the inside, and no one ever had a reason to go in there. It was where we could let our guard down, even if just for a few stolen moments. It was in that room that I realized just how much Evan affected me. The way he'd look at me, his eyes dark with intensity, made me forget everything else. The way he touched me, like I was something precious, made my chest ache with feelings I didn't want to name. But as careful as we tried to be, it was impossible to keep everything hidden. One evening, I was heading to the storage room, my heart pounding with both anticipation and dread, when I nearly ran into Jessica in the hallway. "Burning the midnight oil again?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Just wrapping up a few things," I said, forcing a smile. Jessica studied me for a moment, her eyes sharp and calculating. "You've been staying late a lot lately. So has Evan. Funny how that works, huh?" I froze, my stomach twisting into knots. "We've been working on the same project," I said, keeping my tone light. "Deadlines are brutal." She didn't sound convinced. Jessica had always been perceptive, almost annoyingly so. She was the kind of person who thrived on office gossip, and I knew she wasn't above digging for dirt if she thought there was something worth finding. I tried to brush off her comment, but the encounter left me on edge. At home, things were even more complicated. Dean's work kept him busy, which should have made it easier to hide what was happening. But the tension between Evan and me was impossible to ignore. One evening, Dean and I were sitting at the dining table, eating dinner in near silence. Evan was upstairs in his room, supposedly working on something for the project. "How's everything going with the game?" Dean asked, his tone distracted. "It's fine," I said, focusing on my plate. He looked up, frowning slightly. "You've been spending a lot of late nights at the office." "There's a lot to do," I said quickly. "You know how these projects are." He nodded, but his gaze lingered on me for a moment too long. I felt like I was under a microscope, every move I made scrutinized. Later that night, I found Evan in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a glass of water. "Your dad's starting to notice," I said softly, keeping my voice low. Evan set the glass down and stepped closer. "He doesn't notice anything unless it's work-related." "That's not true," I said, even though I knew it was. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "We'll be careful." I wanted to believe him, but the knot in my stomach wouldn't go away. The turning point came a week later. It was late on a Friday night, and Dean was away on another business trip. Evan and I had spent the evening on opposite sides of the house, deliberately avoiding each other. But as the hours dragged on, the pull between us became impossible to resist. I found him in the living room, sprawled on the couch with a video game controller in his hands. He looked up when I walked in, his expression unreadable. "We can't keep doing this," I said, my voice trembling. "I know," he said, setting the controller down. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us felt heavy, charged with everything we weren't saying. And then he stood, crossing the room in a few quick strides. His hands found my waist, and before I could protest, his lips were on mine. It was reckless and stupid, but I couldn't stop myself. I kissed him back, pouring weeks of pent-up frustration and longing into that one moment. We didn't hear the car pulling into the driveway. Dean wasn't supposed to be home until Sunday, but when the sound of the front door opening reached us, panic set in. "Go," I whispered, shoving Evan toward the hallway. He disappeared upstairs just as Dean walked into the living room, his briefcase in hand. "Claire," he said, looking surprised. "What are you doing up?" "I could ask you the same thing," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The meeting wrapped up early, so I caught a flight home," he said, studying me with a frown. "You look flustered." "I was just tidying up," I lied, gesturing vaguely toward the coffee table. Dean didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't convinced. The near miss left me rattled. For the first time, I truly understood how much I had to lose. But even that wasn't enough to stop me. Jessica's suspicion grew, her sharp comments becoming more frequent. Dean's mood shifted too, his conversations with me more pointed, as if he was searching for something I wasn't telling him. And through it all, Evan and I couldn't stay away from each other. Every stolen kiss, every secret touch, felt like a risk worth taking, even as the walls closed in around us. I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. By the time everything came to a head, the cracks in my life were impossible to ignore. My marriage to Dean, my career, my relationship with Evan, they were all teetering on the edge of collapse. Every step I took felt like walking a tightrope over a pit of fire, and I knew it was only a matter of time before I fell. The breaking point came one Friday night. Dean and I were having dinner, the silence between us heavier than usual. For weeks he'd been distant. Not the usual, distracted by work kind of distant. But something else. It felt like suspicion. "I think we need to talk," Dean said suddenly, breaking the silence. My fork froze mid-air. "About what?" "About us." He leaned back in his chair, studying me with an intensity that made my stomach twist. "Something's been off lately. You've been different." I forced a laugh, trying to play it off. "Different how?" "You're distant. You're always at work, always distracted when you're home. You barely even talk to me anymore." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "Is there someone else?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. For a moment I couldn't speak. "What? No," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "Of course not." Dean didn't look convinced. "Then what's going on, Claire? Because something's not right." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. The guilt was suffocating. I could feel it pressing down on me, making it harder to breathe. "I don't know what you want me to say," I finally managed, pushing back my chair and standing. "I'm tired. I think I'm just going to go to bed." Dean didn't stop me, but I could feel his eyes on my back as I walked away. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Dean's words kept echoing in my head. "Is there someone else?" The answer was yes, of course. But it wasn't just anyone. It was Evan. My stepson. The guilt was almost unbearable, but so was the thought of letting Evan go. The next day, I avoided both of them. Dean left for work early, and I spent most of the morning locked in my home office, pretending to be buried in emails. Evan was downstairs, but I didn't trust myself to be alone with him. It wasn't until late in the afternoon that I heard a knock at my door. "Claire?" Evan's voice was soft but insistent. I hesitated before opening the door. His expression was serious, his brows drawn together in concern. "What's going on?" he asked, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "Nothing," I said quickly, looking away. "Don't lie to me." He reached out, gently tilting my chin so I had to meet his eyes. I can tell something's wrong. I wanted to tell him everything, to confess how scared I was, how guilty I felt, how torn I was between him and the life I'd built with his father. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I said, "Your dad thinks there's something going on." Evan's jaw tightened. "Does he know?" "No, but he's suspicious. And Jessica, she's been making comments too." He nodded, his hand dropping to his side. "We'll be more careful." "Evan, that's not the point." I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I don't know how much longer I can do this." His eyes searched mine, and for a moment I thought he was going to argue. But then he said, "I don't want to lose you." The raw emotion in his voice broke something inside me. I reached out, pulling him into a hug. He held me tightly, his chin resting on the top of my head. "I don't want to lose you either," I whispered. For the first time, I let myself admit how much he meant to me. This wasn't just physical. It hadn't been for a long time. That night, everything came to a head. Dean was working late, and Evan and I were home alone. We tried to keep our distance, but the tension between us was unbearable. Eventually, I found him in the living room, pacing back and forth. "Evan," I said, and he turned to face me. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice breaking. "Pretending like nothing's happening. Pretending like I don't care." I stepped closer, my heart pounding. "What are you saying?" "I love you, Claire," he said, his eyes shining with emotion. "I know how wrong this is. I know what's at stake. But I can't help it. I love you." His words hit me like a freight train. I'd been trying to avoid thinking about what this all meant, about how deep my feelings for him had grown. But hearing him say it out loud made it impossible to ignore. "I love you too," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. The moment the words left my mouth, he was in front of me, his hands on my face, his lips crashing against mine. This kiss was different, desperate, full of all the emotions we'd been holding back for so long. We didn't hear the door open. Dean's voice cut through the room like a knife. "What the hell is going on here?" We broke apart, spinning toward him. His face was a mix of shock and fury, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Dean," I started, but he held up a hand to stop me. "I knew something was going on," he said, his voice low and dangerous. I didn't want to believe it, but now... He shook his head, his eyes narrowing at Evan. "Get out." Evan hesitated, his jaw tightening. I said, "Get out." Dean roared, his voice echoing through the room. Evan turned to me, his eyes filled with regret. "I'm sorry," he whispered before walking out the door. After he left, the house felt suffocatingly quiet. Dean and I stood there in silence, the weight of what had just happened hanging heavy between us. "I trusted you," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I never meant for this to happen." But the damage was done. The days after that night felt like a slow-motion car crash. Everything I'd worked so hard to build, my marriage, my career, my carefully maintained facade, had shattered, and I was left standing in the ruins. Dean didn't speak to me for 3 days. He didn't come to bed, didn't sit down to eat, didn't even look at me. He spent most of his time in his home office, the door locked, the hum of his phone calls with clients seeping into the hallways like a distant reminder of the life we'd pretended to have. Evan was gone. He packed a bag the night of the confrontation and left without saying goodbye. I didn't know where he went. He wasn't answering my texts, and I didn't dare call him. Dean's fury was still fresh, and any contact with Evan would have only made things worse. At work, the tension was unbearable. Jessica had clearly noticed something was wrong. She watched me closely during meetings, her sharp eyes darting between me and the empty chair Evan had once occupied. His absence hadn't gone unnoticed by the rest of the team either. Rumors started to swirl. He'd left the company suddenly, no explanation, no goodbye. "Rough week?" Jessica said one morning as we waited for the elevator. I forced a tight smile. "Something like that." Her smirk told me she wasn't buying it. By Friday, Dean finally broke the silence. I was sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a cold cup of coffee, when he walked in. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, his tie loose around his neck. He sat down across from me, his movements slow and deliberate, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. "I want to know everything," he said finally, his voice low and strained. I swallowed hard, my hands trembling around the coffee mug. "Dean, No excuses, he interrupted, his gaze cutting through me like a blade. I need to hear the truth. All of it. And so I told him. I told him about the late nights at work, the stolen moments, the feelings I hadn't meant to have. I told him about the storm, about the hotel on the work trip, about every reckless decision that had led us to this point. By the time I finished, Dean's face was pale, his jaw tight. How long? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Months, I admitted, my chest tightening with shame. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. I trusted you. I trusted him. How could you do this? I didn't have an answer. That night, Dean packed a bag and left. He didn't say where he was going or when he'd be back. He just walked out the door, leaving me alone in the house that suddenly felt too big, too quiet, too empty. I spent the next few days in a fog. I went to work, answered emails, sat through meetings, but it all felt meaningless. The only thing I could think about was Evan. Where was he? Was he okay? Did he hate me for everything that had happened? I finally broke down and called him. The phone rang, and just when I thought he wouldn't pick up, I heard his voice. Claire. The sound of his name hit me like a wave. Evan, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. I'm so sorry. There was a long pause. Where are you? At home, I said, my voice trembling. I'll come by, he said, and the line went dead. When Evan showed up that evening, he looked different, tired, older somehow. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by something heavier, more serious. I didn't want to leave, he said as soon as he walked in. But after what happened, I didn't know what else to do. I understand, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of everything we'd been through pressing down on us. I can't stop thinking about you, he said finally, his voice breaking. Even after everything, I can't let you go. Tears welled up in my eyes. Evan, this isn't fair to you, to anyone. We've ruined so much. I don't care, he said, stepping closer. I don't care about the fallout or the consequences. I care about you. His words shattered what little resolve I had left. Before I could stop myself, I closed the distance between us, my arms wrapping around him. For a moment it felt like nothing else mattered. Just him and me, holding on to each other like our lives depended on it. But the reality of our situation was impossible to ignore. The next morning, I woke up to find Evan sitting on the edge of the bed, staring out the window. We can't keep doing this, he said quietly. I sat up, my heart sinking. Evan. No, listen, he said, turning to face me. I love you, Claire, but this isn't sustainable. It's hurting everyone around us, it's hurting you. Tears filled my eyes. What are you saying? I'm saying we need to stop. His words felt like a knife to my chest, but deep down I knew he was right. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my life. Dean filed for a separation, and Evan left the company for good. I stayed in the house, surrounded by the ghosts of everything we'd lost. I thought about Evan every day, wondering where he was, what he was doing, if he was thinking about me too. Sometimes I'd catch myself hoping he'd show up at my door, that we'd find a way to make it work despite everything. But he never did. Months later, I saw him again. It was at a coffee shop downtown, a chance encounter that felt both surreal and inevitable. He smiled when he saw me, but there was a sadness in his eyes that mirrored my own. Hi, he said softly. Hi. We sat down together, and for a while we just talked, about work, about life, about everything and nothing. When it was time to go, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. I'll always love you, he said quietly. I'll always love you too, I replied. And then he walked away, leaving me with the bittersweet knowledge that some things are too complicated, too messy, to ever have a happy ending. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the living room windows, casting long, golden beams across the carpeted floor. It was one of those rare, quiet days when the house seemed to breathe on its own, alive only with the faint creak of settling wood and the occasional chirp of a bird outside. I sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by a sea of old photographs and yellowed envelopes. I didn't know why I had started organizing the boxes. Maybe it was the weight of the silence, or the way the light made the dust motes dance in the air, reminding me of time slipping through my fingers. These pictures had been tucked away for years, hidden behind the attic door, like the parts of my life I didn't know how to revisit. I picked up a photograph, the edges slightly curled from age. It was a picture of my late husband, James, leaning against the old oak tree in the backyard. His broad smile was as familiar as the smell of his cologne, and seeing it again felt like a fist tightening around my chest. He had been gone for 3 years now, but there were still days when the grief felt fresh, raw, like an open wound that refused to heal. The sound of footsteps on the stairs pulled me from my thoughts. I glanced up to see Gavin, his long frame filling the doorway. He looked different from when he first arrived. Less guarded, though there was still a quiet weight in his eyes that hadn't fully lifted. "Hey," he said, his voice easy but warm. "What are you up to down here?" I held up a handful of photographs. "Just going through some old memories. Thought it was time to make sense of this mess." He stepped into the room, his gaze drifting over the piles of pictures and papers spread around me. "Looks like you've got your work cut out for you," he said with a faint smile. "Tell me about it," I replied, returning his smile before turning back to the photo in my hand. Gavin hesitated, lingering in the doorway for a moment before stepping closer. "Mind if I join you?" The question caught me off guard, though I wasn't sure why. He had been nothing but kind and considerate since he moved in a few weeks ago, always offering to help with chores or fix something around the house. Still, there was something about the way he asked, the way his voice softened, that made my heart skip. "Of course," I said, gesturing to the empty space beside me. He sat down cross-legged, close enough that I could feel the faint warmth of him beside me. He reached for a nearby photo, holding it up to the light. "Is this you?" he asked, grinning as he studied the image. I glanced over and couldn't help but laugh. It was an old picture of me from years ago, standing in front of a snow-covered cabin, bundled up in an oversized coat. My cheeks were flushed from the cold, my hair tucked under a knitted hat. "It is," I said, shaking my head. "I'd almost forgotten about that trip." "You look happy," Gavin said softly, his grin fading into something more thoughtful. I felt a pang in my chest at his words. I said quietly. That was a good time in my life. We fell into a comfortable rhythm after that, passing photographs back and forth, sharing stories and laughter as we unearthed moments from the past. Gavin seemed genuinely interested in hearing about my life with James, about the family gatherings, the trips, the little inside jokes captured in each picture. But as the evening wore on, the laughter faded into something quieter, more reflective. Gavin picked up a photo of himself as a young boy, standing beside James, his arms crossed in a way that seemed far too serious for a child his age. "I remember this day," he said softly. "He was teaching me how to ride a bike. I kept falling, and I got so frustrated I didn't want to try anymore." I glanced at the photo, my heart tightening. "He was patient with you," I said. "He always said you had a stubborn streak, but he admired that about you." Gavin smiled faintly, his gaze lingering on the picture. "He always made me feel like I could do anything," he said, his voice tinged with quiet sadness. I didn't know what to say. There were no words that could fully ease the loss we both carried, the absence that had left a void neither of us knew how to fill. As the light outside began to fade, I realized how close Gavin had moved. His knee brushed against mine as he leaned over to place the photograph back on the pile, and the faint contact sent a shiver through me that I couldn't ignore. I shifted slightly, my heart beating faster than it should have. "We should probably call it a night," I said, my voice trembling slightly. Gavin looked at me then, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought he was going to say something, but instead, he nodded and pushed himself to his feet. "Yeah," he said, his voice quieter now. "Probably." He lingered for a moment, his gaze meeting mine, before turning and walking toward the stairs. As I sat there in the quiet, surrounded by the remnants of a life I wasn't sure how to move forward from, I couldn't stop thinking about the way his presence filled the room, the way his voice lingered in my mind long after he was gone. Something was shifting, and it scared me. The next morning was one of those lazy Saturdays, where the hours seemed to stretch endlessly. I busied myself with small tasks around the house, folding laundry, dusting shelves, but my mind kept drifting back to the night before. The way Gavin had looked at me when he held that photograph, the quiet sadness in his voice as he spoke about James. And then later, the way his knee had brushed against mine. The warmth of him so close. It was nothing, I told myself, just a fleeting moment, a product of two people navigating the loneliness of loss. But that didn't explain the way it lingered, or the way my chest tightened every time I thought about it. I was wiping down the kitchen counters when Gavin's voice startled me. "Hey," he said, stepping into the room. I glanced up, my heart skipping as I took him in. He was dressed casually in a gray t-shirt and jeans, his hair still slightly damp from a shower. "Good morning," I said, forcing a smile. "Morning," he replied, leaning against the doorway. "Do you need any help with breakfast?" I hesitated, caught off guard by the offer. "I was just about to make something simple," I said. "You don't have to." "I don't mind," he interrupted, his smile easy. "I've been living here for weeks now. I should probably contribute something other than my mess." I laughed softly, the sound surprising even me. "All right," I said, nodding toward the fridge. "Let's see what we can come up with." We worked side by side, the small kitchen feeling even smaller with the two of us moving around each other. Gavin reached for the eggs while I chopped vegetables, our movements occasionally overlapping, a brush of shoulders here, a fleeting touch there. Each contact sent a spark through me, a quiet hum of awareness that I tried desperately to ignore. "So," Gavin said, breaking the silence as he cracked an egg into the bowl. "What's the plan for today?" "Nothing exciting," I said, focusing on the cutting board. "Just some cleaning, maybe a little gardening." "You've been doing a lot of that lately," he said, glancing at me. "It keeps me busy," I replied, shrugging. Gavin tilted his head, his gaze lingering on me. "You don't always have to stay busy, you know. It's okay to take a break." His words were simple, but they hit harder than I expected. "I know," I said softly, though the truth was, I didn't know how. As we cooked, the conversation turned lighter. Gavin told me stories about his college years, the friends he'd made, the embarrassing moments he still laughed about. His laughter was infectious, and I found myself smiling more than I had in weeks. When the omelets were done, we sat at the small kitchen table, the sunlight streaming in through the window. "This is good," Gavin said, taking a bite. "You're a better cook than you give yourself credit for." "I had a good teacher," I replied, smiling faintly. "James loved to cook." Gavin's expression softened, and he set his fork down. "He did," he said quietly. "He always made it look so easy." "He had a way of doing that," I said, my chest tightening. For a moment, the air between us grew heavy, the weight of shared grief settling over us. But then Gavin smiled, small and genuine. "I think he'd be happy to see us here," he said softly. I looked at him, my throat tightening. "I hope so." After breakfast, we lingered in the kitchen, washing dishes and tidying up. The quiet rhythm of it, the clinking of plates, the sound of water running felt oddly comforting. At one point, Gavin reached over to grab a towel just as I moved to pick up a plate, and our hands brushed. "Sorry," he said, his voice soft, but he didn't pull away immediately. "It's okay," I said, my voice trembling slightly. His eyes met mine, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow to just the two of us. The quiet hum of the house, the sunlight filtering through the window, it all faded, leaving only the weight of his gaze, the warmth of his hand lingering against mine. "I'm glad I'm here," he said finally, his voice low. The words caught me off guard, and I felt my chest tighten. "I'm glad you're here too," I said softly. The moment stretched, thick and heavy, until I finally stepped back, breaking the connection. "I should finish cleaning up," I said quickly, turning away. "Yeah," Gavin said, his voice quieter now. I could feel his gaze on me as I busied myself with the dishes, my heart pounding in my chest. Later, when the kitchen was spotless and Gavin had retreated to the living room, I sat at the table, staring at the empty plate in front of me. Something was shifting between us, something I didn't know how to name. And it scared me. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting golden light over the rolling hills beyond the house. The air was cool, with the faintest breeze tugging at the edges of the trees. I had been sitting by the window, watching the sunlight flicker across the leaves, when Gavin appeared in the doorway. "Come with me," he said, his voice light but insistent. "Where?" I asked, glancing up from the book I hadn't really been reading. "You'll see," he replied, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I hesitated, caught off guard by his sudden invitation. But there was something in his expression, a quiet determination, a kind of hope, that made it impossible to refuse. "All right," I said, setting the book aside. We walked in comfortable silence, the gravel path crunching softly beneath our feet. The lake wasn't far, just a short stroll through the woods behind the house, but the journey felt like stepping into another world. The trees arched overhead, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patches on the ground. Birds called to each other in the distance, their melodies blending with the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. "Do you remember the last time we came out here?" Gavin asked, breaking the silence. I glanced at him, startled by the question. "It's been years," I admitted. "I think it was for James's birthday." Gavin nodded, his gaze distant. "Yeah, he wanted to fish, but we ended up just sitting by the water, talking about everything and nothing." A small smile tugged at my lips. He had a way of making the simplest moments feel special. "He did," Gavin said softly, his voice tinged with nostalgia. When we reached the lake, the sight took my breath away. The water was still, a perfect mirror reflecting the vibrant colors of the trees and the sky above. The air smelled of earth and damp leaves, the kind of scent that made you feel grounded, connected to something bigger than yourself. Gavin walked ahead, his hands tucked into his pockets, and stopped near the edge of the water. I followed, my steps slow and deliberate, as though I didn't want to disturb the fragile tranquility of the moment. This was his favorite spot, Gavin said, his voice quiet. I nodded, my gaze fixed on the water. "He loved it here," I said softly. We stood there for a while, the silence between us filled with the soft lapping of the water against the shore. "Can I ask you something?" Gavin said suddenly, his voice breaking the stillness. "Of course," I replied, glancing at him. "Do you ever feel like you're stuck?" he asked, his gaze fixed on the water. The question caught me off guard, but the vulnerability in his voice made my heart ache. "All the time," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Gavin turned to look at me, his expression earnest. "How do you deal with it?" I let out a soft, shaky laugh, shaking my head. "I don't know that I do," I said honestly. "I keep busy. I try not to think about it too much, but sometimes it feels like I'm just going through the motions." Gavin nodded slowly, his brow furrowed in thought. "That's how I've been feeling too," he said. "Like I'm just existing, not living." His words hit closer to home than I cared to admit, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. "You're young," I said softly. "You have time to figure it out." "So do you," he replied, his tone gentle but firm. The simplicity of his words, the quiet conviction in his voice, left me breathless. I looked away, my gaze drifting back to the water as I tried to steady myself. We sat down on the edge of the lake, the cool grass pressing against my palms as I leaned back. Gavin stretched out beside me, his head tilted toward the sky. "I miss him," he said after a while, his voice barely audible. "So do I said, my throat tightening. "But being here with you," Gavin continued, his gaze shifting to me, "it doesn't feel so heavy. It feels okay." His words settled over me, warm and soothing, and I felt my chest tighten in a way that wasn't entirely painful. "I'm glad you're here," I said softly, my voice trembling slightly. Gavin smiled then, small but genuine, and for a moment, the weight of everything else seemed to fade away. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the lake in shades of gold and orange, I felt a quiet sense of peace settle over me. We walked back to the house as the first stars began to appear in the sky, the silence between us no longer heavy but comfortable, like an unspoken understanding. When we reached the porch, Gavin paused, his hand resting on the railing. "Thank you," he said softly, his gaze meeting mine. "For what?" I asked, my brow furrowing. "For coming with me," he replied. "For everything." I didn't know how to respond, so I simply nodded, a small smile tugging at my lips. As I watched him disappear into the house, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years: hope. And for the first time in a long time, it didn't scare me. The rain started just after dinner, a gentle patter against the windows that quickly turned into a steady downpour. Thunder rumbled faintly in the distance, and the lights flickered once or twice before settling into an uneasy glow. I had always loved storms, the way they wrapped the world in a cocoon of sound and made the indoors feel impossibly warm and safe. Tonight, though, the storm felt different. The house seemed quieter than usual, the spaces between the thunder stretches of silence that felt almost alive. I was sitting by the fireplace, a blanket draped over my legs, and a glass of wine in my hand. The flames crackled softly, their glow casting flickering shadows across the room. I had been trying to read, but the words blurred together, my thoughts too restless to focus. When Gavin walked in, I wasn't surprised. Somehow, I had known he would come. He carried a bottle of wine and 2 glasses, his smile easy but hesitant, as though he was waiting for me to tell him to leave. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, nodding toward the armchair across from mine. "Of course not," I said, my voice softer than I intended. Gavin poured himself a glass, then settled into the chair, his long legs stretched out in front of him. The firelight danced across his face, highlighting the angles of his jaw, the warmth in his eyes. For a while, we didn't speak. The storm outside filled the silence, the rain a steady rhythm against the roof. "You always liked storms," Gavin said suddenly, his voice breaking through the quiet. I glanced at him, startled. "How did you know that?" He shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Dad used to tell me, he said you loved sitting by the fire during storms, that it made you feel, what did he call it? Centered." A lump rose in my throat at the mention of James, and I looked away, my gaze fixed on the flames. "He was right," I said softly. We lapsed into silence again, the weight of the past settling between us like a third presence in the room. "Do you ever think about him?" Gavin asked, his voice quiet. "All the time," I admitted, my fingers tightening around the stem of my glass. "He was such a big part of my life. It's hard to imagine a day when he doesn't cross my mind." Gavin nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I think about him too, about what he'd say if he were here." "What do you think he'd say?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Gavin hesitated, his gaze fixed on the fire. "I think he'd tell us to stop being so hard on ourselves," he said finally. "To stop holding on to the past so tightly that we forget how to live in the present." His words hit me like a physical blow, and I felt tears welling in my eyes. "He always did have a way of saying the right thing," I said, my voice trembling. Gavin leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he looked at me. "He wouldn't want you to feel like this," he said softly. "Like you're stuck." The honesty in his voice, the quiet intensity of his gaze, it was too much, too raw. I looked away, my throat tightening. "I don't know how to move on," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I don't know how to let myself feel anything." "You don't have to figure it out all at once," Gavin said gently. "But you deserve to feel something, Margot. You deserve to be happy." The way he said my name, soft, deliberate, sent a shiver through me. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw something in his expression that made my chest tighten. "Gavin," I began, but the words faltered on my lips. "You don't have to say anything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just let yourself be here. Right now." He reached out, his hand brushing against mine where it rested on the arm of the chair. The touch was light, tentative, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me, a quiet hum that lingered long after he pulled away. The storm outside grew louder, the thunder rolling closer, but inside, the world felt impossibly still. Gavin leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady but unassuming, as though he was waiting for me to make the next move. I set my glass down on the table, my hands trembling slightly. "You're right," I said finally, my voice shaking. "I don't want to feel stuck anymore." Gavin's expression softened, and he leaned forward again, his hand covering mine. "You don't have to do this alone," he said quietly. The warmth of his touch, the steadiness in his voice, it was enough to unravel the last thread of resistance I had been clinging to. I didn't know what I was doing, or what this meant, or where it would lead. All I knew was that for the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't drowning. For the first time, I felt like I could breathe. The storm showed no signs of letting up. The rain hammered against the windows, thunder rumbling so deeply that it seemed to shake the floor beneath us. Yet the world inside felt unbearably still, the crackle of the fire the only sound between us. Gavin's hand was still resting over mine, warm and steady. I didn't pull away, though every voice in my head screamed that I should. Instead, I stayed there, caught in the quiet intensity of his gaze, the weight of everything unspoken pressing down on my chest. "You're trembling," he said softly, his thumb brushing against my fingers. It's the storm, I whispered, though we both knew it wasn't true. Gavin leaned closer, his voice low and steady. It's okay to be scared, Margot. My breath caught at the way he said my name, the way it fell from his lips like a quiet promise. I don't know what I'm doing, I admitted, my voice trembling. You don't have to know, he said gently. Just be here, right now. His words wrapped around me, warm and grounding, and I felt something inside me begin to unravel. Before I could stop myself, I looked up at him, really looked at him, and saw a vulnerability in his expression that mirrored my own. Gavin? I began, but the words faltered as he leaned closer, his face inches from mine. You don't have to say anything, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire, and then his lips were on mine. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as though he was giving me every chance to pull away, but I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I leaned into him, my hands gripping the fabric of his shirt as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had been spinning for far too long. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer, and I felt myself melt into him, the heat of his body grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. When we broke apart, my breath was shaky, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. We can't do this, I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Why not? Gavin asked, his gaze steady and unflinching. Because it's wrong, I whispered. Because you're. Don't, he interrupted gently, his hand cupping my face. Don't push me away because of what you think this is supposed to be. Tears welled in my eyes, and I shook my head. I'm scared, I admitted. So am I, he said softly. But I'm not scared of this. I'm not scared of how I feel about you. His words broke something in me, and before I could think better of it, I kissed him again. This time with a desperation that startled even me. The room seemed to fade away, the storm outside a distant hum, as we lost ourselves in each other. His hands were gentle yet firm, tracing a path down my back that left me breathless. I let myself feel every touch, every kiss, every whispered word, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel numb. We sank to the rug in front of the fire, the heat of the flames mingling with the heat between us. Gavin's touch was reverent, as though he were memorizing every inch of me, and I felt my walls crumble under the weight of it. Margot, he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. I'm here, I whispered, my hands threading through his hair. I'm here. The night unfolded in a series of moments that blurred together, his lips on my neck, the way his hands trembled slightly as they roamed my body, the soft gasps that escaped my lips despite myself. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered word felt like a lifeline, pulling me back to a place I thought I'd lost forever. When it was over, we lay tangled together on the rug, the fire casting flickering shadows across the room. I rested my head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat as my own began to slow. Neither of us spoke for a long time, the weight of what had happened settling over us like a fragile thread we were both afraid to break. Are you okay? Gavin asked finally, his voice low and tentative. I nodded, my fingers tracing lazy patterns on his chest. I don't know what this means, I admitted. Neither do I, he said softly, but I know it felt right. His words were simple, but they carried a quiet conviction that steadied me. I tilted my head to look up at him, my gaze searching his. Do you regret it? I asked, my voice trembling. Not for a second, he said, his eyes locked on mine. His honesty was like a balm, soothing the raw edges of my fear and doubt. I rested my head against his chest again, letting the steady rise and fall of his breathing lull me into a fragile sense of peace. The fire had burned down to embers by the time we finally moved, and when we did, it was with a quiet understanding. Gavin helped me to my feet, his touch steady and grounding, and we stood there for a moment, the silence between us filled with unspoken words. Good night, Margot, he said softly, his hand lingering on mine. Good night, Gavin, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. As I climbed the stairs to my room, I felt a mix of emotions too tangled to name. But one thing was certain, something had changed between us, and there was no going back. The morning sunlight crept through the windows, casting long beams across the wooden floor. I woke slowly, the weight of the previous night pressing gently against my chest. For a brief, blissful moment, I forgot everything. Forgot the storm, forgot the intensity of Gavin's gaze, forgot the way my name had sounded on his lips. But as reality settled in, so did the flood of emotions. Regret, fear, exhilaration. They all tangled together in a knot that tightened with every breath. I sat up, pulling the blanket around me as if it could shield me from the thoughts swirling in my head. The house was quiet, save for the faint sound of birds chirping outside. I wondered if Gavin was awake, if he was downstairs waiting, if he felt as unmoored as I did. I wasn't sure I was ready to face him. I lingered longer than usual, brushing my hair, straightening the quilt on my bed, finding excuses to delay what felt inevitable. But eventually, I made my way downstairs, my heart pounding with every step. The smell of coffee greeted me before I saw him. Gavin was in the kitchen, his back to me as he poured a steaming mug. He was dressed casually, the light gray t-shirt he wore clinging slightly to his shoulders. When he turned and saw me standing there, his expression softened. "Morning," he said, his voice warm but tentative. "Morning," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. He held out the mug. "Coffee?" I nodded, taking the cup from him, my fingers brushing his briefly. The touch was fleeting, but it sent a jolt through me, a reminder of everything we hadn't said yet. We sat at the kitchen table, the silence between us heavier than usual. Gavin sipped his coffee, his gaze fixed on the window, while I stared at the steam rising from my cup, trying to find the right words. "About last night," I began, my voice trembling. Gavin set his mug down, his attention snapping to me. "Margot, if you regret it—" "I don't," I said quickly, cutting him off. "I don't regret it." His shoulders relaxed slightly and the tension in his jaw eased. "Then what?" he asked softly. I let out a shaky breath, my hands tightening around the mug. "I don't know what this means," I admitted. "I don't know where we go from here." "We don't have to figure it all out right now," Gavin said gently. "We can take it one step at a time." His words were simple, but they steadied me in a way I hadn't expected. I looked up at him, meeting his gaze, and saw nothing but patience and understanding in his expression. "Okay," I said softly, my voice barely audible. The day passed slowly, the weight of the conversation lingering between us but not suffocating. Gavin didn't push me to talk more, didn't try to define what had happened. Instead, he was simply there, his presence steady and reassuring. In the late afternoon, we found ourselves in the garden. The air was warm, the sun casting a soft glow over the newly planted flowers. I crouched by one of the beds, pulling a few stray weeds, while Gavin worked beside me. "This looks better than I expected," he said, glancing around the yard. "You don't give yourself enough credit," I replied, smiling faintly. He chuckled, the sound low and easy. "I couldn't have done it without you." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made my chest tighten. I looked at him, my gaze lingering on the curve of his smile, the warmth in his eyes. "Gavin," I began, my voice faltering. He looked up, his expression soft but intent. "Yeah?" I hesitated, my throat tightening. "Thank you," I said finally, "for being here, for everything." "You don't have to thank me," he said softly, his voice steady. "I do," I insisted, my voice trembling, "because I don't know where I'd be if you weren't." His gaze didn't waver, and for a moment the world seemed to still. "You don't have to do this alone anymore," he said, his voice low but firm. I nodded, my chest tightening with a mix of fear and hope. "I know." That evening, we sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and orange. The air was cool, the faint hum of crickets filling the silence. Gavin leaned back in his chair, his hands resting loosely in his lap. "Do you think it'll ever stop feeling complicated?" he asked, his voice quiet. "I don't know," I admitted, my gaze fixed on the horizon. "But maybe it doesn't have to. Maybe it just is." He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I can live with that." We sat in silence for a while longer, the weight of the day settling over us like a blanket. But it wasn't a heavy weight. It was the kind that grounded you, that reminded you of where you were and where you wanted to be. As the stars began to appear in the sky, I turned to Gavin, my heart pounding. "I don't know what the future looks like," I said softly, "but I know I want to face it with you." His expression softened, and he reached for my hand, his touch steady and warm. "One step at a time," he said, his voice a quiet promise. I nodded, a small smile tugging at my lips. One step at a time. And for the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't walking alone.